My name is Mateusz Benedyk. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Wroclaw, and I would like today address the topic of does austerity in Europe equal spending cuts? There has been kind of strong narrative we can hear in the media that austerity policy hampers economic growth in Europe, especially in peripheral countries, so-called PIGS countries, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And according to this narrative, austerity policy, that is cutting government spending, how media usually formulates it, lowers nominal spending and therefore leads to deeper recession, and we are getting some kind of downward spiral that has no end, and therefore that we should abandon austerity policy and instead focus on economic growth. And this narrative is rooted in a specific economic theory. So what I want to say first, just quickly look at two competing theories about what is the effect of government spending on the economy, say the Keynesian one and the more Austrian one. Then I will proceed to a more empirical stuff and see, try to look what government spending actually are in Europe since the crisis began. But to do it, we need to take a minute and answer a question: how to measure spending? Because there is no one quick answer to this question. So I will define three different measures of government spending and then see how government spending in Europe, especially in PIGS countries, look like according to these three measures. And in the end, I hope to give you some conclusions about what austerity policy actually was in PIGS countries, and if austerity policy actually meant cutting government spending, what effect does it have? Okay, so according to the Keynesian vision of the economy, if the economy is in crisis, we need someone to step up and money should be spent, because private investment is going down. That's very volatile, variable, and when it's going down, the income must fall, and therefore people spend less and the income falls even lower, and so forth. So therefore we need some agent, for example government, to step in and boost aggregate demand. And this government spending will result in the multiplying of income. The magic of multiplier is that when you spend $1, you can gain 2 or 3 or even more dollars of additional income, because you spend, producers have new revenues, so they start to invest, and they hire more people, and they spend, and so forth and so forth. But there's also alternative version of what government spending really is and how it affects economic system. According to this vision, government spending is actually a burden on economy. And it leads to misdirection of resources, not to economic growth. Government spending takes resources out of the realm of economic calculation and just arbitrarily redistributes the income to other sectors that politicians favor. In order to spend some money, government must tax, borrow, or inflate, and each of these activities hampers the growth of private sector. Taxes reduce the marginal revenue from productive activities, therefore discourage from additional production. Borrowing takes away savings from private sector, so there is less for entrepreneurs to borrow and invest in new projects. And inflation redistributes money from producers to people who take money first, and when it's in the form of credit expansion, it misallocates resources even more in a way that Austrian theory of business cycle explains. So, according to the Keynesian version, in a crisis, the right thing for the government is to spend more. According to the more Austrian, or how it was called today, liquidationist vision, government actually should spend less. So now, let's think about how can we measure this government spending. The first obvious reason is to just look at nominal figures. For example, we have a country, and government then on different levels, central, local, social security, spends to 100 billion euro per year. So we may see how it changes year to year. If it grows, if it's smaller, that's pretty easy to acknowledge. But counting economic variables in only nominal terms may seem not entirely justified. Because, for example, the value of money is never the same. We have inflation, deflation. So we should take that into account. And we can also take into account that economy as a whole can be bigger or smaller. So we should take economic growth or economic decline into account as well. So to do that, a lot of mainstream economists likes to use a measure of public expenditures as a share of gross domestic product. And then we can see that, for example, public expenditure rose from 43% to 46%, or the other way around. So we'll also look at this measure. But the whole concept of GDP may be flawed a little bit, even if we abstract from the fact that it's impossible to measure wealth directly. If you would have to produce, let's call, an Austrian measure alternative to GDP, we have some proposals. And mostly there have been two proposals from Austrian circles, one from Murray Rothbard and one from Robert Hicks. And what is the problem? The problem is, should government spending be counted in a measure of welfare? For example, GDP. And even back in the 1940s, when GDP and whole national account statistics were created, there was a lot of discussion about should government spending be counted in national product. And even like the godfather of the national account statistic, Simon Kuznets, was not entirely convinced that they should be counted in GDP. Why not? GDP, you only count the value of final products, and some may say that what governments offer is more intermediate product. It's not final consumption product or final investment. Moreover, it's more important, there are no real prices for government services, since in the realm of government, there's no economic calculation, there are no voluntary transactions, and therefore no voluntary ratios of goods to money we call prices. So we're not really sure what is the price of government services. is kind of an artifact. For example, GDP was measured for Soviet Union, and according to these numbers, Soviet Union was expanding really fast and should overcome America, say, by year 2000. And even Paul Samuelson wrote this kind of stuff in his famous textbook. But it turned out it was just a statistical artifact, because since there were no real prices under socialist economy, GDP did not have a lot of sense. And on a smaller scale, it is also true for all of the government spending. And we have yet another objections. We have no prices for these services, but we don't really know if these services improve our welfare, if they are part of production, in the sense that production is to fulfill some of our needs. For example, Polish government spends money, let's say, occupying Afghanistan. So we're not really sure if occupying Afghanistan increase my welfare or welfare of any other Polish citizen. But still, we pay wages to the military, we buy armaments, so they are counted in GDP, even though some people will say that it's a waste of money, it's a waste of resources, or some would even say that's morally compelling and that's something that offends them, not increase their welfare. So what to do about it? There are, I would say, two roads. One is a radical one, proposed by Murray Rothbard. Rothbard wrote a famous book, America's Great Depression. And in this book, among many other things, he showed that fiscal policy during the Hoover era, 1929, 1932, was actually expansionary. And he showed it by composing his own measure of product in the economy. It was private product remaining. He made the assumption that government services actually is a negative thing for our welfare. So we should not only not count government services in GDP, but we should extract them from the GDP. And also what is remaining is the private product. But there is also, let's say, more agnostic version by economist and economic historian Robert Hicks. And Hicks measures so-called real gross domestic private product. And that's only GDP minus government consumption and government investments. So therefore, we have a GDP number and you just do not count these parts. And for example, Hicks showed that during the last 15 years, American economy was expanding only at a 1.5%, if you take this measure into account, much below the historical average of 3% for the previous periods. So, for example, if you now say that we have a recovery in the United States, we may show using this measure that it's not so rosy as one would say looking at only GDP official statistics. So I will go with Hicks' way, of course, not only because it's easier to calculate. So I will, instead of I will have three measures. One, nominal spending. Two, spending as a share of GDP. And the third, spending as a share of RGDPP, real gross domestic private product, measured by, in a fashion from Robert Hicks. Okay, so what spending in European Union or eurozone, to be more specific really look like? This is in euros, millions of euros. So just looking at the chart, we may say that government spending in Europe was not cut. If you look only at the whole European Union or the whole eurozone, we may say that after, let's say, 2009, the growth of government spending was a bit lower than before, but still there are an upward trend. So if there has been some austerity policy in the whole Europe, it certainly did not show in cutting spending. So it would probably only be raising taxes. But let's disaggregate this data and look at the PIGS countries. So we see that in the case of Greece, they actually did cut some spending from the peak at 2009. In nominal terms, spending now are lower, are around, let's say, 2007 levels for the last data available for 2012. In case of Ireland, the peak was later in 2010, and then the spending were cut to, let's say, 2007 levels. And in case of Portugal, something similar to Ireland, peak in 2010, and then some cutbacks in government spending to around 2008 levels. When you look at the other two countries from the PIGS group, we see that Italy and Spain actually did not cut spending. More accurate would be say that government spending in nominal terms is frozen in these countries. But as I said, measuring things only in nominal terms has some set disadvantages. So let's proceed to the other measure, spending as a share of gross domestic product. And in this chart, we also see at the beginning only European Union as a whole and eurozone as a whole. And so, of course, percents on the left scale. So we see that when the crisis began, 2008, 2009, the spending grew considerably from around 46, 47% to 51%. And since then, it was cut a little bit, but it's still around 49, 50%, so much below what we experienced before the crisis. So some spending was cut in the Europe, but it's still much more a burden than before the crisis. And in this table, we see spending as a share of GDP for PIGS countries. If something is in red, it means that government spending is higher than the year before. If something is green in this table, it means that government spending is lower than the year before. Yellow color means no change at all. So let's look at each of these countries. In Portugal, we see that spending measured as share of GDP peaked in 2010 at 51.5%, and since then was cut to 47.5%, so 4% cut. Not so bad, I would say. Still more than pre-crisis, but some cuts were done in the last 2 years. Similar case in Ireland. In 2010, it was a spectacular 65.4%. And since then, it was cut to 47 in 2011 and 42% of GDP in 2012. So also, according to this measure, there were some actual cuts to government spending in Ireland. In the case of Italy, we don't see that there is trend as clear as in case of Portugal and Ireland. The spending now in 2012 is a little bit lower. It's 50.6% than in peaked at 2009 to 52%, but still the cut is not very significant, not nearly as high as in Portugal or Ireland. And you see that sometimes the spending is lower, sometimes it's higher. In case of Greece and Spain, we see that there are no cuts according to this measure. In Greece, in 2012, actually the government's spending was 54.8%. It's like the record, the highest in this period, and similar case in Spain, 2012, 47% of GDP, so also the highest since 2005. Of course, much higher than pre-crisis when it was around 40%. There's a lot of data, so just quick our observations so far. Greece, Ireland, and Portugal cut government spending in nominal terms. Spain and Italy froze spending at approximately 2009 levels. Portugal and Ireland cut public spending measured as a share of GDP. Italy, Greece, and Spain haven't so far managed to do so. And let's proceed to our third measure, spending as a share of gross domestic private product. And this measure shows us, say, similar story to the share of GDP, but the changes are, I would say, more dramatic. In case of Portugal and Ireland, we see that they did cut government spending as measured as a share of private sector. Portugal from 69 to 59%, Ireland from 84 to 52%. These are 2008, 2007 levels, respectively. In Italy, there were some cuts from the heights from 2009, but still not so significant than in case of Portugal and Ireland. And it actually rose a little bit in 2012. Greece and Spain also did not cut spending significantly. 2012 is only 2% lower than 2009. In case of Greece, in case of Spain, the difference is only 1%. So we see that Portugal, according to all our measures, did cut spending. But from here in the media, Portugal is still in, say, economic distress. So maybe public spending actually hurts. Public spending cuts actually hurt the Portuguese economy. I think we should not jump into that conclusion. I think there are some remarks we can make here. For example, public spending are still high. In Portugal, for example, still almost 60% of private product. So it's, say, in the middle of Europe, according to this measure. So there's still a big burden on the private sector. And Portugal has some structural issues when it comes to economy, to, say, private property enforcement, labor market, state enterprises, and so forth. So it will explain that even if we give them, let's say, good incentive in the form of public spending cuts, it will probably take a while for Portuguese economy to process it and to give some positive effects. And actually, from the latest data available from the second quarter of 2013, Portugal started growing. On a quarter-to-quarter basis, in quarter two, GDP grew by 1%. On a year-to-year basis, it's still in the recession, but it's like the first quarter-to-quarter growth since many years. So it may be a sign that economy started to recover. And another sign is that employment grew a little bit in Portugal, even though also in the 2013, the first months, even though Portugal government is still laying off some people. So actually public sector must have hired more people. And we also see that if you measure economic growth in terms of GDP, if you cut public spending, it's like a statistical accountancy thing that you will have a lower GDP growth. But when you look at our Fixian real gross domestic private product measure, it actually grew by 3.5% in years 2009-2012. It's not much, it's a bit more than 1% a year, but it still shows that GDP numbers may portray the situation as more dire than it really is for the private sector. And Portugal or Ireland are not the only countries in Europe that actually did cut public spending. I listed here some countries that lowered significantly share of public spending in gross domestic private product. And we have 10 countries here: Bulgaria, Germany, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, United Kingdom. And in the first column we have peak of public spending according to this measure in which year and the number. And in the last column, data for the latest data available 2012. And we see that, for example, Lithuania cut spending dramatically from 60.5% to 46%. And if you look at these 10 countries, and Ireland and Portugal, that we also said cut spending, out of these 20 countries, 10 recorded GDP growth in 2012. 10 enjoy quarter-to-quarter GDP growth in the latest data available second quarter of 2013. There is no data for Ireland so far, and in Bulgaria it was only 0.1% decline, so not very significant. And 10 enjoyed year-to-year GDP growth when it comes to the last quarter. There is no data for Ireland, and in Portugal, as I indicated, they grew on a quarter-to-quarter basis, but on a year-to-year basis, they are still minus 2%. And we may also see that the countries that have the highest GDP growth now are Latvia and Lithuania. And these countries are exactly the ones that lower the burden of public spending on private economy the most. If you go back to our tables, we see that in the case of Latvia, it's around 12% of our measure was cut. In the case of Lithuania, even 14%. And we see that this spending are quite low, 45, 46%, whereas in the United Kingdom or Hungary, it's 63%. Now let's look at a country that did not cut spending significantly. And let's take the case of Netherlands. Netherlands is a country that said to say it's a relatively good economic institution. Private property rights are there enforced. Labor market is quite elastic. And it shows that in the index of economic freedom, they're on 17th place. In doing business index, 31st place. So I would say below European average. It's a country with a long history of capitalism, stock market, money market, and so forth. They have a lot of capital accumulated, a lot of savings, so they should handle the recession pretty well. from looking only at this data. But if you look how did public spending in Netherlands happen to be in the crisis years, we see that they continue to spend a lot more money in the public sector than they used to before the crisis. In 2008, public spending was 65% of gross domestic private product. Now it's still 74%, only a little bit lower than 2009 peak of 76%. And this country, for the last 7 quarters, is exactly in a recession. So you may see that big public spending, even in a country that should behave well in economic distress, when you look at its institution, actually may have put that country, this expansionary fiscal policy, into recession. So, let's go to our conclusions. First of all, austerity measures in many countries did not include significant spending cuts. We saw it in the case of Spain or Greece. Spending was not cut according to most of our measures. So what is sold, let's say, as austerity policy in the media is mostly tax increases. But there are countries that actually did cut spending according to our favorite measure, public spending as a share of gross domestic private product. And these countries are the countries that are doing the best in the European Union. They're mostly out of recession. Some of them enjoy really high economic growth. And I think that when you look at this data, we may venture to say that the dichotomy of economic growth and spending cuts is a false one, and that, say, the Austrian framework that spending cuts is a burden on the private economy rather than a blessing explains this data better than the competing Keynesian theory. Thank you. Any comments or questions?
Yes. Did you ever look at the composition of government spending and the difference between investment and consumption spending? Because if you wanted to take it one step further, when you look at Spain and the fact that it's had more or less steady nominal government spending throughout this recession, let's say, neither increasing nor decreasing, the composition of the spending has changed quite a bit, and in particular, social transfer payments have gone up through the roof with everybody on unemployment, things like that. And they've made pretty drastic cuts to things like education, let's say. So they're reallocating their spending. And if you think about cuts to education, which is probably more or less malinvestment on the side of the Spanish government, to just doing a straight up transfer payment to somebody else, it's still government spending, but at least that's just income that somebody's spending privately after the fact, so it's probably less damaging in a way. So I think there's a possibility to take the analysis one step further to look at the actual composition and makeup of government spending instead of just treating it all as equal.
Okay, but even if you take, say, even transfer payments do not count in GDP, so they're already excluded.
Yeah. I'm not saying as part of the analysis that you have, but just to look at it within the fact that if you're looking at nominal figures, there is a pretty big difference of what's going on within that, within
the overall government spending.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah, but it's possible that it's less damaging, but I'm not really convinced that we are able to say it. Yes, you still need to tax someone to do it, or and this social transfer also have negative consequences. So
Yeah.
Yes, it discourages people from looking forward or something like that.
Yes, I mean, I have two comments. The first comment is regarding Portugal, to analyze Portugal economy, right? And well, maybe you should also take into account that Portugal is close to Spain, right? It's attached to Spain. So maybe, probably, they haven't grown enough because the Spanish economic crisis somehow is making trouble also in Portugal, right? It has some negative setbacks in Portugal. That is one thing. And the second thing is regarding I think excluding the public expenditure from the GDP, I think is not totally fair. I mean, I agree that we cannot take into account public expenditure as a part of the GDP, at least 100% of the public expenditure, but I mean, for example, for me it's not the same going to Afghanistan than to build a road that connects Wroclaw with Warsaw, right? So there is something there. I don't know how can we solve it. I mean, I have been thinking about this issue many times. I think that the road variant approach is too radical.
And I think good.
Yeah, and I don't know, because it's not the same to make a road or to make a school or a hospital than to, I don't know, for example, do a war or whatever. So.
Yeah, but still, even if you've told yesterday about building roads to every small town.
Again, it's not the same to do a highway which is going to be empty than to do a highway between two big cities.
Yeah, but still, if you're out of economic calculation,
We have all sorts of investment that we know is malinvestment, and we include that in the calculation. You don't talk about excluding private investment, and malinvestment is just like mal-government spending.
yeah, but sure, there are malinvestment exposed, and when someone was doing the transactions that are accounted in GDP, that they were thinking they're doing something right. So I don't think we're now able.
Well, what's the difference between including private investment on a home that doesn't even get finished and including government expenditure on a road that gets used?
This way we could do not count private product at all if we go along these lines. But if we have money investments, later investments will be lower, and it will occur, let's say, a year later or 2 years later in the data. Yes, lower than the year before, so we'll see it as a recession. So I think partly we showed in data. When it comes to government spending, there's no such feedback, I would say.
Oh, the only difference is voluntarily. I mean, you cannot measure the satisfaction that brings a private investment. That's true, but the crucial difference is voluntarily of the decision, of the investment decision.
I don't think that's true at all. There's all sorts of services that government provides that would be provided anyway. It's only a matter of how efficient and at what price they're going to provide them at. So legal services, policing services, for example, either it's going to be provided by government and included in G, or it's going to be privately provided and you're going to include it in I. What's the difference?
But I cannot calculate the counterfactual. How much of it would arise on the free market?
Yeah, but I'm saying you can't exclude G out of hand just because you don't like government spending. You don't know if you want it or not, just like you don't know if some private investment is going to pan out or not. So if you're going to start excluding all of G,
but the
you
private
better get ready to start excluding some I as well.
But even still, if we do not exclude G, when we look at public spending as share of GDP, the story is quite similar. It's yes, public expenditure of GDP also decline in Latvia or Lithuania, and it's still high in Netherlands. The differences are bigger, let's say, in this Hicksian measure, but the story is basically, I think, the same when you look at traditional GDP.
So why go out through all the work to exclude it?
The same story. Because I still think that cutting government spending is pointless and scientific. I would say we have no reason to count it, since there are no prices. It is like measuring GDP for Soviet Union, really.
I think it depends on what you want to use the figure for. And maybe GDP is not the best figure to use in all instances. So if you want to come up with a figure for private income, fantastic. But I don't think that you can make a blanket statement of excluding. You can't make a blanket general argument for excluding all government expenditure because you think it's not desired or not wanted, or you can't make a welfare statement about it and not start looking at the other components of private GDP and doing the same thing.
Yes, but I can calculate. There is a calculation in the private part of the economy, and I know that government, in order to spend, has to do something that hampers private production, and that's not the case in the private sector. So I would say
it is the case in the private sector. If you have malinvestment, where somebody allocates some capital to build a house that nobody wants, that's capital that can't get allocated to a use which is actually positive. So you do have the same argument.
He bought himself expensive consumption goods. That's his problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so just a quick comment on this discussion. I guess that the problem is that a GDP was first conceptualized as a measure of nominal spending and not a measure of real wealth. So if we look at the GDP purely from a monetary perspective, then it doesn't really matter spend the money. We look at nominal aggregate spending, but then if we want to measure when we want to say GDP is a good measure of real wealth, then this is another story.
Okay, but so if what it is supposed to measure nominal spending, why extract all the intermediary goods?
Of course,
it exactly shows that it was invented to show the wealth.
Not really. I guess the theory is that it is spending on final goods that determines the supply of final goods in the next period. So if, let's say, spending on old paintings, this is an example that William Jäger gives. If there is a very high increase in a demand for old paintings and their prices rise dramatically, it will not lead to an increase in the supply of old paintings because all the painters are already dead. So this is why we only focus on final goods, and this is also why.
No, I think that's something different, because the first time this painting is sold, it is counted in GDP. Well, you only reselling, you don't count reselling it. That's okay, but what about all the capital goods that were before the painting?
I don't think I get the point. I mean, I know that the painting will be probably counted when the painting was actually painted, so let's say 17th century, right? But I guess the problem with including all products in GDP is that generally, when there is an increase for used goods, this will not induce an additional supply, increased supply in the next periods. This is at least the theory that calculations of GDP are based on. So this is why we only count final goods, final new goods. But of course I do agree that this measure of nominal spending is incorrect. It should be that all goods that are spent in a given period of time are counted. But this is the critique you mentioned. I don't think it's a good one.
I really cannot agree with you. If you have intermediate goods that are not counted in GDP, yes, only these investment goods that, let's I buy a hammer, it will not transfer to something else. It's, let's say, it's a final good, even if I use it in production process. But, for example, if I buy a piece of steel and do it something with the hammer and sell it to another factory, it will not be counted, yes, because national account statisticians say it's double counting the same. If GDP was supposed to measure nominal spending, it would have to increase all of them. Only if you want to measure the output, and that's what GDP is all about, the output, and that's supposed to transfer into wealth in a given period of time. That's why you have to exclude intermediate goods.
Okay, something is missing in this picture that you described, because we are focused only on public expenditure and we compare it with GDP. But don't you think that the most important question is how do we finance the public expenditure in the years of recession? Do we raise taxes or do we make a bigger deficit and bigger public debt? And this proportion between raising taxes and making new public debt, maybe it is connected with this burden on private sector, and maybe it make some space for development, or make it impossible to develop the economy after the recession.
I think all the ways financing government spending has similar consequences, so therefore it's not really that much of a difference. It's hard to say which one is, let's say, least costly for the private sector. And I think it's like in the political process, it's like the spending part that determines the rest. Yes, we have spending, and then we think about how to finance it. I think that's more how it works.
To build off that, is this a paper that you have?
No.
Okay,
That's an addition.
It's good. It's not bad. It's really good. It's just that you need to start by specifying what you're trying to design this measure for. So GDP, if you want it for a measure that's going to be total income in the economy, that's something different than saying you want to come up with a figure that talks about the ability of government to borrow, or the ability of the private sector to keep producing, even under the burden of a growing government. So yours, if you phrase the argument that you have, there's a lot of merit to it, of using these figures, in the sense that if you're looking at austerity and you're trying to figure out how maxed out is the government getting, how small is the private sector that's going to get taxed to pay for this growing government. If you're comparing those two sectors, then this is really relevant, right? But the criticisms that I leveled before are more aimed at using a figure like this as a measure of income, let's say, in the economy or something like that. So what I'm saying is what you've done is good. It seems to me you need to start from identifying what you're trying to do, why you want this figure, and that then you end up with different figures potentially that you want to develop.
I think the thing was that I wanted just to do something that, say, mainstream economists would do. So this first measure, and the third one, the one that say that the burden on the private sector, I think that's the best way to show it. And that.
Well, it's a nice way. It's incredibly relevant when you use it in the sense of looking at European countries at cross-section during the recession and look at the dwindling ability of the private sector to keep financing these growing public sectors, and how cuts to the public sector are allowing the private sector to recover. So that's where it's really useful, right? Yeah, that's quite a narrow use instead of a broad, income figure.
Yeah, that's supposed to be the point, I think. Okay, thank you for for the questions and comments.